Chat. Welcome, chat. How's everybody doing today? Welcome to another Healthy Gamer GG stream. My name is Alo Kanoja. A reminder that although I am a psychiatrist, nothing on stream today is intended to be taken as medical advice. And everything on stream is intended to be for educational or entertainment purposes only. If y'all have a concern or question, please go see a licensed professional. So hope y'all are doing well. For those of you in the United States, we had President's Day yesterday, which was super nice. It's nice to take a day off, spend some time outdoors. So couple of quick announcements. So I was going to share something with y'all today that I think is a little bit different. So I was going to lecture, I put together like a small lecture around adipose tissue. So sometimes, most of the stuff that we try to lecture about is like directly related to mental health and tends to be like somewhat applicable, right? So like we'll teach like, how does the ego work? How does identity form? Things like that. But every once in a while, I run across something that is really at the frontier of science, and we don't really know how it directly applies to us, but it's really, really cool, and it's actually quite revolutionary. So in the past, for example, we've talked about, different scientific topics. And so today, I just wanted to share some really interesting stuff that I've personally been following for the last couple of years, because I'm curious about like the clinical impact, the health impact, things like that. But the trials really aren't there yet. At the same time, I still think it's like really interesting and could potentially be beneficial. And so I put together a quick lecture about fat, actually, so adipose tissue. And we're going to dig into this perception that fat is like essentially energy storage and is inert. But it turns out that fat could be the largest like endocrine organ. It's not really an organ because it's distributed in the body. And it's very, very metabolically active. It's very hormonally active. So I was going to talk a little bit about that today. We're also going to talk a little bit about, so sometimes like when people, fat loss herbs and things like that. So like there's a lot of like media stuff, scientific articles. So we were going to look at some of the different chemical compounds that have been studied in terms of their impact on fat. And specifically what we were going to talk about is essentially how to be careful about that stuff, because, sometimes like media outlets won't really go into detail about the nature of the study. So we were going to compare and contrast a couple of different herbal compounds just so we can understand like, what constitutes, what are the different levels of science. And when people like will say, oh, this thing is helpful at reducing fat or will help you with weight loss, like what are they really saying and what is that truly based on? So that's what we're going to do today. If we have time, we're going to get into a couple of posts about perfectionism and unrequited love. Next thing, we're going to talk a little bit, we're going to address some concerns about, some of our coach contract stuff. And last kind of update is going to be the final dopamine detox session is this Friday at 11 a.m. Central Time, 5 p.m. GMT. So if y'all spend too much time on video games, Reddit, TikTok, etc., check it out. I understand that it's been a pretty big hit, and a lot of people have developed a healthier relationship with technology. A reminder that this too is a peer support intervention. So it's just a group of people on the internet getting together and sort of working through how to develop healthier relationships with technology. So let's go ahead and dive into posts. Okay. We're going to do this one quick, and then we're going to go to we're going to do the lecture. So is it true that coaches are tied to a $50,000 debt if they quit immediately? So the answer is not really. So just so that someone leaked our coach contracts recently, and there's a clause in there that's essentially an intellectual property clause. So this is a clause that we put into the contract to protect our IP. And just so people understand about the actual facts, so we've had several coaches, I want to say maybe close to a dozen, that have left within a year or a few months of finishing our educational curriculum, and this clause has never been exercised. So oftentimes if coaches do want to leave, rather than being punitive, we're actually like very supportive. So sometimes after people coach for a couple of months, they'll realize, oh, I enjoy working with people, but I really want to do clinical work. So they want to help people and want to become therapists. And so rather than, charging them for this kind of stuff or exercising this clause, what we'll actually do is like support that. So we're big believers in supporting people to become therapists, and we'll, oftentimes serve as professional references, write letters of recommendation. So I know that sometimes legal language can look scary. The truth of the matter is that we haven't exercised this clause, not even partially. So the other thing about the legal language is that it's like, it's partial and it's prorated and stuff like that. But we've never exercised this as of yet, and it's really an IP protection. So I just wanted to clarify that. So on to lectures. Okay? So the first thing that we're going to talk about today is fat. And mainly the role of fat within the body. And in order to talk about this, we're going to have to embark on a couple of like basic physiologic kind of things. Okay, so we're going to explain a couple of systems and basic physiologic concepts with the body. So the reason that I personally got interested in this is because a lot of times when it comes to helping people, like even when I think about my patients, I've been astonished by how much exercise or weight loss can help improve people's mood and like overall well-being. So we know that the body and mind are like very, very closely connected, right? So there's a mind-body connection. The interesting thing that I'm excited about more recently is that this mind-body connection has been historically sort of like propagated by people like people who are into yoga or Tai Chi or, meditation, and that's totally fine. There's nothing wrong with any of those things. We're big believers in the value of yoga, Tai Chi, meditation, because there's been science about that. And that's what actually gets me pretty excited, is that there have been lots of clinical trials now on yoga, for example, to reduce the effects of osteoarthritis or rheumatoid arthritis, Tai Chi and osteoarthritis. So there are a lot of inflammatory conditions that can get positively affected by these sorts of things, as well as like mental health conditions. So we know that, for example, like doing yoga and meditation and stuff like that can have positive effects on mood and even clinically reduce symptoms of things like generalized anxiety disorder or major depressive disorder. So we know that there's a mind-body connection. So now what I'm super excited about is like, as science progresses, what we're sort of discovering is like, what is specifically the nature of the mind-body connection? So what is happening in our body, and what are like the chemical compounds, hormones, paracrine, autocrine factors? So those are different things in the hormonal system, which we'll explain in a second, that sort of relate to and affect our mind and other parts of our physiology. And one of the biggest discoveries over the last, I want to say decade, but maybe even closer to 15 years, because remember, y'all, science moves slow, right? So this hasn't really, even in a sense, hit the mainstream yet, even though there's been like 10 or 15 years of research on it, is that fat is not energy storage. So there's been a perception that we have these things called adipocytes, and that adipocytes are our fat storage cells. And we've sort of believed that basically as you eat, for example, more carbohydrates, so carbohydrates really stimulate adipocytes. And as our fat cells, as we make more fat cells and as our fat cells grow and fill up with fat, we've sort of assumed physiologically that like that's what they are. It's just like your fat is just kind of sitting there, right? So your belly fat, other parts of your fat are just like, they're just storage. And so as we exercise more, as we eat healthier, as we start to enter a negative caloric state, that like we start to burn more calories than we use. And so then we get rid of the fat. So it's just storage. It's kind of, we're filling up our vaults with fat and energy. And as we start, stop making deposits and start making withdrawals, we like burn out that fat. But the really interesting thing recently is that adipocytes are actually very endocrinologically active. And what does that mean? So, in terms of our body, we have something called the endocrine system. So the endocrine system is the system of hormones, generally speaking. And what is a hormone? So a hormone is a chemical compound that travels through the bloodstream and affects distant organs. Right? So if we think about our adrenal glands, which are sort of situated like right here, like kind of in the back, they sit above our kidneys. Our adrenal glands will secrete adrenaline, right? So if we get like some kind of, let's say there's we're driving down the street and someone like swerves in front of us, we'll get a burst of adrenaline. So that's a chemical compound that's released from here, travels through our bloodstream and starts to have all kinds of different effects. So I think of hormones as essentially like body-wide signals. It's almost like stances in like gaming. So there's like tank stance, there's DPS stance, there's going into stealth. So it's sort of like a kind of a body-wide, like, let's get all of our organ systems in line. Let's get our skeletal muscle, our heart rate, our digestive system, our brain all kind of focused in the same direction. So a good example of this is that adrenaline will increase our heart rate, will increase our blood pressure, will reduce blood flow to our digestive system. Because when adrenaline is active, we don't need to be metabolizing nutrients. Like, we're not worried about like digesting things and, you know, storing things away for later. We're worried about survival. So it'll constrict blood vessels to our stomach and our intestines and our colon, and it'll dilate blood vessels to our skeletal muscles, to our arms and legs. So what we're basically doing is rerouting blood flow from our GI system to our muscles. Other examples of adrenaline, they also affect your brain. So when adrenaline is in the brain, we start to see the world as more black and white, and we start to see like more danger in things. And we tend to start to make like very, very like rapid decisions, right? Because if we're being attacked by a tiger, for example, like we don't want to sit there and like think philosophically about whether the tiger is friendly or hungry or what. Like we need to act. So hormones act body-wide. So the interesting thing here is that we understand a lot of, you know, hormonal actions and stuff. There's thyroid hormone, adrenaline, insulin, glucagon, all that kind of good stuff. We understand how these things work. But one of the most interesting recent discoveries, and once again, recent is like 10 to 15 years, is that adipocytes are endocrinologically active. And so what that means is they secrete all kinds of stuff that has different kinds of effects on different parts of our body. So rather than being like inert, what this sort of means is that a lot of what people may experience if they are overweight or they do have central adiposity. So there's even data that shows that central adiposity is worse than peripheral adiposity. And what does this mean? So basically, like when the majority of your fat, or if you have more fat that's around your belly, that tissue seems to act differently. Not all adipocytes are the same than fat that let's say is around your thighs or your arms or your back or whatever. So it's kind of interesting because not all adipocytes, because remember that fat is sort of distributed throughout your body. Like we'll have sort of belly fat, we'll have visceral fat, which is the fat that surrounds our organs. We'll have peripheral fat. We'll have some fat like around our thighs and things like that. And it seems that central adiposity is like worse for health outcomes than peripheral adiposity. So I'm a little bit rusty on this stuff, but for example, I think central adiposity has worse cardiovascular outcomes. So if you have this, two people with the same grams of fat on their body, the person who has all of their fat sort of located around their belly region is more likely to have worse cardiovascular outcomes, which includes things like heart attacks, than people who have fat that's like evenly distributed through their body. And so that sort of suggests that not all adipocytes are the same, which in turn sort of, and as people started to explore that, what they sort of discovered is that adipocytes are endocrinologically active. So let's take a quick look at some of the measures of what fat actually does. Okay, so I'm going to go to a quick review article, but this is white fat. So if we look, let me see if there's a better diagram here. Yeah, here we go. This is going to be easier to understand. So this is, if we look at white fat, so what people have sort of discovered is that there are all kinds of effects from white fat. So we're going to kind of zero in on a couple. So the first that we're going to talk about is appetite regulation and nutritional intake. So what this sort of means is that the amount of fat you have will actually affect things like how hungry you feel, okay? The second thing that we're going to talk a little bit about is insulin. So glucose and lipid metabolism, this is really, really important. So for example, like diabetes. So one of the things that has been shown to clinically improve diabetes and insulin resistance and healthier blood sugar metabolism is actually losing weight. So this is another example of something that's kind of like not really a clinical treatment, right? So exercise is not a clinical treatment. Like it's not a medicine that's prescribed, but is part of something that you can do to clinically improve a illness. So glucose and lipid metabolism are affected. Body weight homeostasis is affected by the amount of fat you have. But there's also all kinds of stuff that we didn't sort of realize. One is vascular tone control. This means blood pressure. It affects our coagulation cascade and fibrinolysis. So what this sort of means is like clotting. So the risk factors of stroke or developing a deep vein thrombosis, having things like a pulmonary embolism, like these are all things where coagulation sort of affects our ability to, for example, coagulate if we get a cut. But it also does things like if we're too pro-coagulant, what that means is that we can develop a blockage within our blood vessels. And a stroke is essentially like, let me just explain this. So why is coagulation important? So if you're in a procoagulatory state, I've got a blood vessel that's going to my brain. And if my coagulation proteins are all messed up, what they're going to do is they're going to coagulate and they're going to stop blood flow. And then once I stop blood flow, what this means is that like the brain over here is like not receiving blood, and then I end up with something called an ischemic stroke. Okay? So remember that coagulation proteins are there to stop blood flow. So if I get a cut on my arm, it starts to bleed, and then my coagulation proteins like show up, and then they'll like block the cut, and then they'll, then you'll scab over, and then you get that little like blood scab, right, which is hard and is blood and is not really skin. You can pick it off and it'll start bleeding again. So that's the coagulation process. The really interesting thing here is that it seems like coagulation balance is actually affected by like the amount of fat that you have. Other really important things are just in general immunity, angiogenesis, reproduction. So what this sort of means is that, so for example, we also know that sometimes if people have difficulty getting pregnant, that affecting their body weight can actually like increase their chances of pregnancy. And there are even some medications that you can take if you are overweight and trying to get pregnant that will help you sort of get pregnant. And some of those medications will do things like affect glucose and lipid metabolism, are also used as treatments for diabetes. So the key thing here is that fat affects like all kinds of different things in your body. And the reason that I think this is important for like our community is because I've sort of seen this as a mental health professional where like sometimes fixing a clinical issue or improving a clinical issue can involve like non-clinical things. So there are, all kinds of patients that I've worked with who will start exercising, for example, and what we see is that like their experience of a depressive episode gets like substantially better. And so we know some of these mechanisms pretty well. So for example, like we know that sunlight has a protective mechanism against depression. And part of the reason for that is because vitamin D deficiency is a risk factor for major depressive disorder. So when I see a patient, oftentimes what I'll do is I'll order a vitamin D test. And if their level is low, then what we'll do is supplement vitamin D, or I'll tell them to get into the sun more. And it's really interesting because it seems to help. There's data that shows that vitamin D supplementation can actually improve clinical depression. So the point about fat is that like this is the kind of thing where if you start exercising and you reduce the amount of white fat that you have, that you may have benefits in all kinds of different parts of your life that you're not really aware of, right? It could help you potentially get pregnant. It could help you with appetite regulation. It could help you with autoimmune diseases. So we're not really sure. There's like different clinical trials depending on what you're talking to. And that's why you should absolutely like, if you're concerned about this and you do have a medical condition, bring it up with your doctor and sort of get their guidance. So let's dive into what some of these things are and why I think they're important. Okay. So the first thing is nutritional intake. There are two things that we're going to talk about, two hormones or chemical signals that adipocytes produce. The first is leptin. So this gives us a sense of satiety. So we tend to have two hormones that will make us feel hungry or make us feel full. The really interesting thing is that generally speaking, leptin is what makes us feel full and ghrelin is what makes us feel hungry. But it appears that something happens when you have sort of dysregulated adipocyte metabolism that causes leptin to be released and can sometimes have paradoxical effects. So something about the amount of fat that you have, and we'll kind of get into other mechanisms, seems to affect how hungry you feel. And if the body was simple, it would be as simple as, oh, leptin makes you feel full, fat produces leptin, therefore fat should make you feel full. But the body's complicated, right? We have dozens and dozens or hundreds of signals having different effects on different organs. And what we sort of find is that leptin metabolism seems to be messed up and can actually like affect people's sense of satiety and how hungry they feel. What precise effect does it have? We actually don't know because it's complicated and we haven't entirely figured it out yet. The second hormone I want to talk about is angiotensin. So angiotensin also affects essentially like our salt intake. So it's a hormone that will really, really affect how much you crave salt. Angiotensin is also very important for blood pressure because our blood pressure is maintained heavily by our, the sodium concentration of our blood. And so, for example, if someone has high blood pressure, we'll give them a medication, or we can give them a medication called an ARB, which is an angiotensin receptor blocker. So what happens is when you block the action of angiotensin, it reduces your blood pressure. So the other thing here that's important is that it affects salt intake, right? And also, like, we know that, for example, reducing weight can have beneficial effects on blood pressure. Blood pressure, having high blood pressure is one of the slowest and most dangerous diseases you can have. Part of the reason it's so dangerous is because you'll never feel it. So our body is very, very good at, if we have a blood pressure of 120/80, we'll feel potentially exactly the same as if we're 160/100. The problem is if you sit at 160/100 for many, many, many years, it can do a lot of damage to your different organs like kidneys, brain, etc. And since our body is so good at adapting to blood pressure, you won't sort of feel it. So one of the trickiest things about being a doctor is getting like patients to take their blood pressure medication, because if they skip 5 days, they don't feel a difference. But if they do take it, they'll sort of experience potentially side effects. So sometimes it can be really hard for patients to like take blood pressure medication because you don't see a benefit, right? It's not like taking like an anti-inflammatory or antipyretic medication like ibuprofen or acetaminophen when you have a fever. It's like you feel instantly better. It's not like taking anti-nausea medication. It's like you don't feel it. Key thing here is that it seems like fat cells will actually secrete leptin and angiotensin. So what we're sort of discovering is that like fat cells are endocrinologically active and will affect like blood pressure in your kidneys. So the next thing that we're going to talk a little bit about is insulin sensitivity. So just to give you all a little bit of background, when we eat a candy bar and we have glucose in our bloodstream, this travels to our pancreas. Our pancreas detects it and secretes insulin, specifically from the beta cells of the pancreas. Insulin then goes to different cells and tells them, hey, we've got a bunch of sugar in our blood. Take that sugar in and stick it in your cell. And so then that ends up reducing the concentration of sugar in our blood. So this is basically how our body signals. Insulin is the signal to our body that we just ate a meal. So what happens when we eat a meal? We digest it in our stomach. We absorb it in our intestines. It gets absorbed into our bloodstream. Insulin gets triggered, and then all of that nutrients, all of those nutrients will get absorbed by our cells. So they get taken up by our brain, they get taken up by liver, they get taken up by skeletal muscle, and they get taken up by adipocytes. So one of the things that we've sort of discovered is that adipocytes lead to insulin resistance. And what does that mean? What does that do? So this sort of makes sense physiologically, right? If you want to think about this from a bird's eye view, remember everything that we're talking about is somewhat of an oversimplification. But the more fat storage you have, the less likely to make fat, because this is what happens over here, you need to be. So our body has something called a weight set point. So a set point for how much we want to weigh, and it's kind of tightly regulated around that set point. And so this is the kind of thing where, like, if we have a bunch of fat, like, it's sort of telling our body, hey, we don't need to store more fat. That's sort of like the general, like, physiologic logic behind it. Physiologic logic. You guys like that? So the tricky thing here is that even though adipocytes cause insulin resistance, like, isn't that a good thing? Well, not really, because when we have a bunch of blood sugar floating around in our bloodstream and it doesn't get absorbed, this is how we end up with diabetes. And the reason that diabetes is bad is because it turns out that having high concentrations of blood sugar in your bloodstream is damaging to your cells. So for example, when we have high blood sugar for prolonged periods of time, we're talking like years or decades, right? For like 10 years, what that does is cause peripheral nerve damage, for example, worsens cardiovascular outcomes. Okay? So what this sort of means is that our bloodstream is not designed to have a bunch of blood sugar there. And so, like, it's supposed to, like, blood sugar is supposed to be, like, relatively transient and or it keeps at a certain level. So it's tightly regulated. If it's way higher than that, it starts to cause, like, damage to our cells. You can sort of think of it like a sewer pipe that gets clogged with stuff, right? Like the sewer pipe is supposed to be, like, free flowing and it's supposed to transport stuff, right? Like, we want it to be, like, moving particular things and move from point A to point B, but we don't want to, like, clog up our sewer pipe even with the stuff that it's supposed to carry. And that can lead to bad outcomes. So the other thing about adipocytes is that they tend to lead to insulin resistance, worsen our blood sugar, and can contribute to things like diabetes. These functions are basically like people sort of get, right? We know that fat has something to do with nutritional intake, insulin sensitivity, metabolism, etc. So this is what gets to be really, really interesting. Inflammatory markers. So fat appears to be a I shouldn't say pro. High levels of fat can lead to a pro-inflammatory state. So there are two markers we're going to talk about, TNF-alpha and interleukin-6. So TNF-alpha and interleukin-6 are two cytokines. So these are like immunological signals. So in our bloodstream, we have like white blood cells. Okay, we also have things like macrophages, which eat other cells. I mean, they eat things like bacteria, and they're flowing around in our bloodstream. When we have high levels of TNF-alpha and interleukin-6, both of these guys go into high alert. So they're like, oh, this means that there's like, let's attack something. It's like go time. And what happens when we enter a high inflammatory state, which can be healthy, right? There's a reason why we create inflammation. Inflammation can be part of the process of healing, can also be part of the process that we use to fight an infection. So when you get, like, let's say I get a cut that gets infected, it gets warm and inflamed and hurts. And why is that? It's because there's vasodilation. So our capillaries are kind of like leaking stuff. And what they're leaking is like white blood cells. So they're leaking like immune system stuff. And then all of our white blood cells are going to the site of battle and conducting a war against the bacteria that are building there. So that inflammation can be a healthy part of our body. The challenge is that when we have a bunch of adipocytes that are kind of like not regulated properly, they can increase the level of TNF-alpha and interleukin-6, and this in turn will lead to pro-inflammatory states. And the problem with pro-inflammatory states is that a lot of the problems that we face medically are like diseases of inflammation. So there are even inflammatory hypotheses for clinical depression. Those seem to be like not great, to be honest. So people have even done clinical trials where can you treat a depressive episode with anti-inflammatory agents? And the answer is like, it doesn't seem like there's great evidence for that. But we do know that there's low levels of inflammation in the brain when people are clinically depressed. So, question mark for clinical depression. But then there are all kinds of other diseases that people suffer from, right? So like arthritis, eczema, IBS, which is inflammatory bowel syndrome, all sorts of autoimmune diseases. So like things like lupus, right? So if you all watch House, like the lupus is always on the differential. So there are all kinds of conditions like psoriasis is another one. So like skin conditions, like different kinds of inflammation, like gastric inflammation, gastritis, like all this stuff gets worse by like, you know, all these pro-inflammatory cytokines. And remember that like the pro-inflammatory cytokines aren't by themselves bad, right? It's just that our body wants them to be active at a particular time and wants them to be like not active at other times. A couple of other things to remember is that I think TNF alpha and IL-6 are the strongest predictors in terms of cytokines, that is, of COVID mortality. Right? So this is just like a simple example of how we've looked at, okay, if people are more likely to die of COVID, what's going on in their immune system? And it seems like they're dumping high levels of TNF alpha and IL-6. The other reason that this is important is not just because of autoimmune stuff, but IL-6 has been linked to aging. So this is another example of like data that is very preliminary. So we don't know necessarily that like IL-6 makes you older. But if we look at the processes of cellular aging and we look at the effects of IL-6 on those processes, what we find is that they tend to accelerate those processes. So there may be some links that having, and there's also some, you know, epidemiological evidence that, for example, like having a low inflammatory state leads to longer lifespan. So this is one of those situations where you have to be really careful about connecting the dots. This does not necessarily mean that having a bunch of adipocytes will mean you age faster, right? So I don't want y'all to draw that conclusion. This is how science works, where like what some, like, you know, we know this piece, which is that IL-6 accelerates, you know, certain cellular processes. Let's just call this process A. The other thing that we know is we'll look at aging, and what we find is, oh, aging also seems to be mediated by process A. So what some people will want to do is they'll say, oh, that means that IL-6 definitively causes you to get older faster, which I don't think is fair to say. We haven't really linked those. But it seems that, I mean, we haven't sort of made that conclusion, but it does seem that there's some linkage. Another good example of this is that, you know, we look at cancer, which essentially ages our cells very rapidly, and IL-6 is sort of correlated with that rapid aging within cancer. Also, our immune system is all over the place when we have cancer. So this is where, once again, like just to be aware that there's all kinds of effects that adipocytes could be having on your body, including potentially accelerating the aging process, which is actually like kind of scary, right? That's why we're sort of sharing it with you. Okay? So there are a couple of other things that we've sort of already talked about, but I'll just kind of mention. So PAI1 is a plasminogen activating something. So this is like the clotting stuff, fibrinolysis. So fibrin is essentially something that can form like a clot. And so what we want to do is break down the clot, right? So over time, what we don't have a clot forever. So when I get a cut, I want it to clot over, and then I want to build skin underneath, and then we want to break down essentially like the dam, which is what a fibrin clot is. It's a dam that prevents flow. And then we want to break it down because we want flow to go back there, right? So on my hand, eventually I want blood flow to be back there. So the key thing here is that it's just another example of a chemical signal that's released by adipocytes. So we'll kind of review those. That sort of affects this kind of stuff. So if we look at, here's an example of all of the actual compounds. We didn't go into all of them that are released by adipocytes and will sort of affect different organ systems. The last thing is that it does seem to affect steroid metabolism. So like we mentioned already, like even things like libido or the ability to get pregnant may be related to the level of adipocytes you have in your body. So we can see that it affects sex steroids. Glucocorticoids are things like stress hormones. So glucocorticoids like cortisol is like the primary glucocorticoid. So when we are in a high stress state, it does all kinds of stuff, right? It messes with our mental, it messes with our physical, it can mess with our stomach, affects like muscle development, affects our rest, all of those kinds of things. So glucocorticoids will sometimes activate the reticular activating formation, which is a part of our brain that causes us to sleep lightly. So when we're in a high stress state, we don't get as restful sleep, which is originally designed to be an adaptive mechanism. Because if we think about the way that we used to experience stress, if I see a tiger footprint, like when I go to bed that night, I want to be a light sleeper because there's a tiger in the neighborhood. Our body was not really designed to experience long-term stress. So if we think about the way that monkeys get stressed out, they don't worry about like paying rent at the end of the month, right? So they don't experience 29 days of constant stress about things at the end of the month. As our society has changed, as we worry about things like how am I going to pay for this, or how am I going to pay rent, or will I be alone forever, or I didn't get any Tinder matches today, it boosts our stress hormones, and then that sort of like wreaks havoc on all kinds of different parts of our body, including our ability to sleep. So we're not going to go into all of these, but we talked about IL-6 and TNF-alpha, which are inflammatory markers, and we talked a little bit about leptin. We talked about angiotensin. These are the clotting factors. So this, once again, is just kind of like I thought it was really interesting because like it turns out that fat actually has a very profound effect on all kinds of our different systems. And sometimes it's really, really surprising because when I've worked with patients in the past who will have something like IBS, it's really interesting what kinds of lifestyle changes can have a clinical impact. So this is also where if y'all have any of these conditions or you're concerned about this stuff, you should absolutely go talk to your doctor about it, right? Say, hey, I have IBS. Like, are there any recommendations that you have for like reducing my body's like inflammatory state? And see what your doctor says. I think it's a very, very good question to ask your doctor. So let me just see if there's anything else in this. Yeah, so this just kind of goes into more detail. So just to kind of summarize, we're going to talk a little bit more, but it turns out that adipose tissue is not just fat storage, but is actually a complicated endocrine organ. The next thing that I want to talk a little bit about is when people sort of discover this, what they tend to do is talk a lot about different kinds of like herbs and supplements or food ingredients that will change white fat into brown fat. So this is where, let's take a step back. So we have two kinds of fat. We have white fat and we have brown fat, okay? And the difference is that white fat we used to think of as storage, and brown fat is used for thermogenesis. So human beings have a very small level of brown fat, whereas bears who hibernate in the winter will have high levels of brown fat. And so what happens is like thermogenesis essentially maintains body temperature. So there are a couple of other interesting things. People in northern climates, generally speaking, have higher levels of brown fat. People with high levels of thyroid hormone also have high levels of brown fat, or sorry, not TSH, T3, T4. Very important distinction. Okay. And this may be like this, these two could be related, right? So as it gets colder, maybe our thyroid hormone goes up and we stimulate thermogenesis. The key thing about brown fat is that it actually burns calories. So the more brown fat we have, like the more calories we burn at like basal metabolic level. So this is without activity. So this is like the amount, like, we maintain a temperature of 98.6. How do we maintain that temperature all the time? By burning energy, right? What's the cell that burns energy? It can be brown fat. So what a lot of people will do is, as people sort of discover, oh, fat is an endocrine organ, like what are all of the things that reduce brown fat? And this is where I think y'all need to be extra careful about like media, because oftentimes what we'll see is like an article that sort of says, oh, there's a new study that found that green tea increases fat burning, which could be true. But I think as we're going to look at this next paper, I'm going to invite y'all to be a little bit careful about that kind of stuff, because oftentimes the media articles won't go into the detail of what kind of study was done and like specifically what they found. This is also where if y'all are thinking about starting something like a supplement or whatever, like absolutely go talk to your doctor about it. It's totally fine to, talk to them, because there may be more to the issue than you realize. The other thing to remember, there's a lot of detail about this in Dr. K's Guide to Mental Health. So we have a video about the safety of using herbal supplements, which I highly, highly recommend y'all check out. Goes into a lot of detail about how you can get liver toxicity and just how to approach supplements and some of the cautions around like supplements, which tend to be pretty unregulated. Doesn't mean that they can't help. There are a lot of clinical trials, which we'll kind of talk about, that have shown that herbs and supplements and things like that can have positive impacts for health. But you have to there are a lot of cautionary things to be concerned about, okay? So what we're going to do is take a look at a couple of different herbs or chemical compounds, like food compounds, that will sometimes get advertised as converting white fat to brown fat, right? And the reason we're sharing this is because a lot of people like watching this are like, oh, okay, so I need to reduce my amount of white fat. How do I do that? Well, if you do a Google search for reducing white fat, what you may find is like articles, right, from like Healthline or WebMD about here are 5 things that you can take that have been shown to reduce white fat or to convert white fat to brown fat. So let's take a look. Okay? So the first thing that we're going to talk about is capsaicin or capsinoids. So these are essentially like the spicy ingredient from peppers. And capsaicin is a good example of actually like a pretty well-studied thing. And I'm going to tunnel down into this. So here's one study. So Snitker published a paper in 2009 where oral treatment with capsinoids in overweight or obese subjects was associated with abdominal fat loss and increase in fat oxidation compared with the placebo group. So this was a study that had a sample size of 80 people, but there are a couple of important things about it. So it's double-blind, placebo-controlled, has a sample size of 80, and is in humans, okay? So this, I think, like there's decent evidence that capsaicin actually does like reduce the amount of white fat you have and may stimulate brown fat, okay? There are a lot of other studies that they sort of talk about, but we're going to compare this with a couple of other studies. So here's a compound that people loved talking about recently. Not recently, like maybe 20 years ago, resveratrol. So resveratrol is a compound it's a natural polyphenol that has been found in red wine and grapes, peanuts. Why is that moving? Grapes, peanuts, etc. So the key thing about resveratrol is that like people started talking about the health benefits of wine with resveratrol. And what they were sort of doing is citing studies. And then people were sort of saying like drinking a glass of red wine is like good for your heart. And so a lot of people who really enjoyed red wine, who had been told for their entire lives that like, hey, maybe you're drinking a little bit too much. Maybe you should cut back. Wine is expensive. Alcohol is bad for you. They're like, see, like resveratrol is good. So here's another example of like, you'll see articles about this where people will say like, oh, resveratrol has actually been shown to like reduce white fat. But let's take a closer look at the actual studies, okay? So the administration of resveratrol in mice fed with a high-fat diet has been shown to reduce the visceral fat pads and suppress adipogenesis. Okay? So like, this is very different from the Snitker paper. Because the Snitker paper is actually giving human beings like capsinoids and measuring what happens. Whereas like this is like giving mice 400 milligrams per kg per day for 10 weeks. Like I have no idea. Like look at this may not be a one-to-one fair comparison because maybe resveratrol is like less concentrated than capsaicin, right? Because you need just a little bit of pepper. But generally speaking, with mice studies, sometimes they'll give these mice like very, very high dosages of stuff because they're trying to detect an effect, right? And it's kind of like mice, so you're not worried about compliance. You're not worried about like, like the mice is having side effects and things like that. You'll just give them a bunch of stuff. So then you'll also have, like gene studies or like cellular studies. So these are studies that, for example, will just take a cell culture and they'll measure like how does gene expression change when I have a bunch of cells sitting in a petri dish and I squirt some resveratrol, like what do the cells start doing differently? So this also is like not even, I mean, they're living cells, but it's not even within a human organism. I mean, it's not even within a mouse organism, right? So like the studies for resveratrol tend to be in mice. So feeding a mice standard diet plus resveratrol induced expression of SIRT1 and UCP genes. So there could be something here, and this is how science progresses. We start by studying things in mice, and then we may move on to studying things in primates, and eventually we'll move on to studying things in humans. But this is where we have to be super, super careful, because like if there's an article that says, oh, resveratrol, did you know resveratrol or drinking a glass of red wine can help you lose weight? And like that could be true, but just be a little bit careful about the level of evidence that people are talking about. So curcumin is another really good example. So curcumin has gotten a lot of interest recently. So curcumin is the active ingredient in turmeric, or one of the active ingredients in turmeric, has been used in Indian and Ayurvedic medicine for many, many, many years. And so what people will do is like they'll say like, oh, did you know that using turmeric can help you lose weight? So the turmeric is a good example. It does have some human studies, right? So it looks like in this study, I think this is a small population size. Recent clinical trial assessed the safety and efficacy of 30-day treatment with curcumin combined with phosphatidylserine in overweight subjects undergoing weight loss by diet and lifestyle intervention. In this study, curcumin administration increased weight loss, enhanced fat mass loss, and induced reduction in waist to hip circumference. But keep in mind, this is the other thing that you have to be careful about, right? Because in this study, they also administered phosphatidylserine with it. So what effect does that have? Does that mean that I can go to a health food store, buy curcumin tablets, and lose weight if I just take it, right? So the answer is we don't know, right? Because in this study, like they added this additional compound. What is the effect of that additional compound? We don't know. This is also where some of the study involves intragastric administration of curcumin, 50 milligrams to 100 milligrams per kg daily in mice, right? So the intragastric is really, really important. So that means they're not even feeding it. They're like putting it directly into the GI system. And this is important, especially for curcumin, because there are some concerns about absorption of curcumin through the GI system of especially humans. So at some of the doses that you may need to create this kind of decreased fat pad or whatever, humans may not like actually absorb that level. So the point here is that, just be careful, because there are all kinds of like caveats when it comes to things like herbal medicine. Green tea is another thing that has been touted for weight loss for a long time. So be a little bit careful about that too. So we know that there are beneficial compounds in tea, like catechins. So the other thing that we have to be careful about in green tea is like how much of the benefits of green tea are due to caffeine versus the catechins. So we know that caffeine has thermogenic properties. And so once again, like we've got some rat studies here and we've got some human studies, right? So with regard to human studies, demonstrated that green tea enhances, I think what is that? Enhanced oxidation. I think it improves fatty acid oxidation, or no, fat oxidation. I'm blanking on what E is. Oh, enhanced energy expenditure. So what this sort of refers to is our baseline, like energy expenditure. So like green tea may have a benefit. So in terms of, so this is good. So the role of green tea in tackling obesity seemed controversial in human trials. So like, there are all kinds of confounding factors, which sort of, I don't know that popular media will like go into. So the key takeaway here is that oftentimes, especially with things on the frontier of medicine, like, adipose tissue is an endocrine organ, it can be like really, really exciting and very informational. So do I advocate for having a healthy level, like a healthy body weight? Like, absolutely. Is this, just a disclaimer, I'm not commenting, hopefully people are not interpreting this as like having anything to do with body positivity. I'm not saying this has anything to do with beauty standards or anything like that. I'm not saying that we should, lose weight for the sake of being more attractive or fulfilling a societal body standard. What we're talking about today is the literal biochemical effects of adipose tissue. And so whether you're overweight, underweight, whatever, like that's not sort of what we're talking about. We're sort of zeroing in on adipose tissue as a potential contributor to all kinds of physiologic problems and health benefits. The key takeaway here is that, if you are overweight or you do have a very central like fat deposition and you suffer from any of these issues, this is something that you should be thinking about. And especially if you have like a clinical diagnosis, absolutely something you should be talking to your doctor about. The last thing to keep in mind is that oftentimes on the frontier of medicine, what people will do is like they'll make studies, right? So it's good that people are studying this stuff. Oh, green tea can help me lose weight. Green tea can promote thermogenesis. Green tea can do all these kinds of things. They'll make all these kinds of claims. And those claims are scientifically valid, but they're not really like valid at the level of like human trials, right? So this is where y'all have to be really careful about health-related compounds, right? I know that a lot of people are very interested in nootropics. So these are things that are sort of good for our brain. But just be a little bit careful because oftentimes, especially as we sort of look at popular dissemination of scientific concepts, they're not really like digging down into, what is the dosage that we're administering to mice? Are these human trials or mice trials? What's the sample size for the human trials? In this case, it's 80, if memory serves. I don't think it's listed here, but, and so just be a little bit careful about that stuff. So I think, sometimes I run across things that I think are really, really interesting. This is something that I personally monitor very, very closely because I am really curious about what we're going to learn about like the endocrine impact of fat. And potentially using like weight loss or reducing our central adiposity or even adjusting, the genetic activation of particular fat cells. So there's some studies that kind of go into that. So if we look at like these compounds, right, this is resveratrol is talking about altering the genetic expression of fat cells. And that will in turn adjust all kinds of things. So keep this stuff in mind, be a little bit careful, be critical of stuff that y'all come across. And if y'all have an actual like health condition, please go see a doctor about it. Okay, questions? Looks like we have time for a couple more other posts. What did I have for breakfast this morning? I had half a banana, a cup of tea, and then a bowl of oatmeal with blueberries. Is stress an inflammatory state? Absolutely. So stress, psychological stress, so we can talk about this for a second. This is also, I think there's a video that goes into a lot of detail about this in Dr. K's guide. So when we have a physiologic state of stress, this causes the release of different compounds. So let's talk about glucocorticoids, like cortisol. And cortisol does all kinds of things. So I think, let me just make sure I understood, caught the question, but okay, whatever. So when we go to cortisol, cortisol will have all kinds of different effects. So it'll increase blood sugar. It'll cause breakdown of fat and muscle. Why? Because we want a lot of available energy, right? It'll also do things like activate our immune system. And why is that? Well, let's think about it. When do we want cortisol active? It's like when we see a tiger in the wilderness, right? So what's likely to happen if we see a tiger in the wilderness? Maybe we'll get scratched. Maybe we'll get bitten. All those, the tiger's fangs have all that juicy, juicy bacteria, which loves getting past your dermis and into your bloodstream. So we want our immune system on high alert, right? It'll also have effects on your brain, right? So it'll make you a light sleeper. And this in turn will lead to less restful sleep. And so like cortisol will wreak havoc on your body. Cortisol is a hormone that is designed to sacrifice long-term health for short-term survival. That's what our adrenaline system is there for, right? Like we can break down fat and muscle, but we need like as much sugar as we can get in our bloodstream so that our muscles, when we start to run and fight, have an endless supply of energy. The challenge is that when we're in this state for a long period of time, we end up actually because there's no short-term threat, right? We're not actually getting attacked by a tiger. And so over time, that long-term stress will actually negatively affect us quite profoundly. There's another really interesting thing about a cortisol tumor, which is that one of the features of a cortisol tumor is something called a buffalo hump. And so we develop fat pads with cortisol tumors. And why is that? So generally speaking, remember what we're trying to do is we're taking muscle and fat, and we're breaking them down into blood sugar. And back in the good old evolutionary days, we would then use that blood sugar to run or fight. So what happens nowadays? Do we run or fight when we're stressed out, when we don't make rent, when we're worried about making rent at the end of the month? Are we running around and being very active? Sometimes, but usually not. Usually we're just stressed. And then the body gets confused. So when we don't use it to run or fight, what happens? Blood sugar starts insulin. And then insulin creates fat. And so essentially what we're doing in high stress states is we're converting muscle to fat. So I'll just show you all a quick picture. Okay. This is where... So this is where, this is literally what happens. You get a fat deposition. And then let's look at Cushingoid habitus. So this is what happens. Oh, this is from Facebook, but whatever. Good God. So this is what a Cushingoid habitus looks like. So for someone who has high levels of glucocorticoid hormones, this is what happens to them. Oh, can y'all not see any of this? Shit. Okay, GG. Let me switch over. Okay, let's start from the top. Okay. I'm going to show y'all. GG. Okay, first thing. Hopefully y'all caught that, but let's start from the top. So stress causes the release of glucocorticoids. Cortisol is one example. Cortisol increases blood sugar. Oh yeah, there was absolutely a diagram. We'll go through it right now. This causes breakdown of fat and muscle in order to stimulate our blood sugar, activates our immune system, makes us light sleepers, so we get less restful sleep. And this is why stress is bad for you physiologically, right? So over time, your blood sugar is going to be high, your immune system is going to be overly active, but there's no infection to fight. Thus, we've got all these soldiers, our white blood cells, which with itchy trigger fingers that are in a high alert state and there's nothing to fight. So what they end up doing is causing autoimmune problems. So we know that stress worsens autoimmune disease. Also causes us to be light sleepers, which means we don't get deep, restful sleep. Last thing that we're going to talk a little bit about in terms of the metabolism, I think this is super interesting. So if you have a cortisol tumor or Cushing's disease, you can get something called buffalo hump. And what happens here, remember that when we secrete cortisol, what we're doing is we're breaking down muscle and fat to stimulate blood sugar. And once we have high levels of blood sugar, we normally want those so that we can run or fight, right? So we want as much energy available to our calves and our thighs and our arms as possible. And generally speaking, when we see a tiger, let's say 10 million years ago, if we saw a tiger, what we would do is hike 8 miles, right? We want to just get the hell away from the tiger. So we need a lot of energy for our skeletal muscles. But nowadays, when we get stressed, we're not running or fighting. So then we have a bunch of blood sugar in our bloodstream. And then after a while, the cortisol starts to wear off. And because there's a antagonistic relationship between cortisol and insulin in some ways. And then we secrete insulin. And what does insulin do? Stores all that blood sugar as fat. So when we're in a stress state, we are literally converting muscle into fat. And what that results in is something called a Cushingoid habitus. Okay, so this is where Like this is literally what happens to people's bodies. You'll see wasting of the arms and legs like muscles, and you'll see fat deposition. So this is a buffalo hump. Okay? Good question. So we should exercise when stressed? Absolutely. You should absolutely exercise when you're stressed. So there's something really cool about exercise. One key thing about exercise, which is why it's so good for all this blood sugar stuff. When you exercise, your muscles will absorb blood sugar without insulin. Without insulin, right? So generally speaking, so what that means is that you are lowering your blood sugar without insulin. And so remember, insulin is going to activate your body's physiology to store that sugar as fat. And so when you exercise, so the insulin resistance that you get with high levels of adiposity, exercise counteracts that like almost directly. Because remember, with insulin resistance, you're not going to be absorbing blood sugar from the bloodstream, right? And so when you exercise, it actually bypasses that whole mechanism. It recruits a completely different physiologic mechanism where it's like, because you're exercising now, right? So we don't care about, like, you're using your muscles. So your body's like, well, if my muscles are active, like they need energy. So let's absorb this stuff. Let's pull blood sugar out of the bloodstream. As the blood sugar gets pulled out of the bloodstream and your blood sugar levels drop, then your body's like, oh, like we have low blood sugar. So let's break down fat, let's break down liver glycogen, let's break down different things so that we can add more blood sugar to the bloodstream. So a lot of I don't know if you guys have seen this, but the actual caloric change from exercise is quite small, right? Like I think if you run a mile or something, you'll burn like 50 calories. Like it's very small. I don't know exactly what the number is. The key thing though is that all these benefits from exercise are not about the direct energy expenditure. They're about adjustments to your body's metabolism, the basic way your body is operating. And when we have like a sedentary life, when we're just sort of sitting in our chair all day, like all those effects get like they're in the wrong direction. Those numbers are really off. Let's see. How many calories does running a mile burn? Okay, so it looks like it's 100 calories. So according to a chart from the American Council on Exercise, a 120-pound person burns about 11.4 calories per minute while running. So if you run a 10-minute mile, you'll burn 114 calories. Right? So 1 mile will burn 100 calories. It's not that bad. My point is that the key thing there is that like when you run that mile, it's not just the calories that you burn. It's the fact that like you're activating your whole body's like metabolism. And so then over the next 24 hours, you will like burn even more calories because your body is like doing stuff, right? So when you run, for example, presumably your leg muscles will get stronger. So when you hypertrophy your leg muscles, what's going to end up happening is like that hypertrophy, the building up of the leg muscle will require energy. It's not just about protein, right? It's like the metabolism involved. Right? So remember that like even when we're sitting around doing absolutely nothing, we tend to burn about 2,000 calories a day. That's just the maintenance of your body requires 2,000 calories, like respiration, heartbeat, all that kind of stuff. So I mean, you may not get too much hypertrophy. Yeah, so Anandamide is originally a compound that I'm not too familiar in a bunch of details, but my understanding of Anandamide is it's the compound that is in marijuana, right? Like, so I think the original person who coined Anandamide was, I think they were Indian and they were studying marijuana. Isn't the brain the most consuming of our energy if you look at the weight energy ratio? I'm not sure. So it's definitely one of the highest consumers of glucose, for sure. So weed, at some point we may have to do like a very in-depth discussion about marijuana, because I think it's like one of these topics where people will make so someone's asking a question, is weed good for stress? So that implies that like there's a binary effect, right? So like either I say yes or I say no. But the truth is, like, hopefully if y'all have been paying attention, like the key takeaway when it comes to like physiology as well as like psychology is that it's complicated, right? It's not like absolutely good and it's not absolutely bad. The other thing to remember is that anytime you're talking about an intervention for a problem, it's a risk-benefit analysis. Whether you're talking about a medication or a substance or even exercise, there's like a risk-benefit analysis, right? So running, for example, is very good for your cardiovascular health, but like can be very hard on the knees. So we can talk about it. The answer is, in my opinion, it's complicated. So that's where, there's an individual discussion that I'll oftentimes have with patients about whether like marijuana is like appropriate for them or not. Generally speaking, I don't advocate for regular marijuana use for most people. I think there's some absolute exceptions to that, like in terms of like I've seen very, very good effects for marijuana use in people who are undergoing chemotherapy. Like I even saw a study recently that marijuana may have some positive impact on COVID-related stuff. But like that also is like these studies are, they're like very initial. So a lot of times people who want to use marijuana and are looking for a justification will jump on these studies. And then similarly, you'll have people on the other end of the spectrum who are like, all drugs are bad and will like be like, oh, never use marijuana. All these studies, like they can't be trusted. Whereas the truth is like, just like anything else we put in our body, like chances are, there's herbs, that is like, so compounds that are supposed to be in our body, right? We're not talking about like clearly toxic stuff, but when we talk about things that human beings will ingest or inhale, like there's a variety of different effects. So, herbs cause liver damage? Absolutely, dude. Can cause liver damage. Okay, so here's my first take on this, which is it sounds like we're getting a lot of questions. So I'm getting the sense that y'all are super interested in this. Is that correct? Do you guys want to see more of this kind of stuff? Like, do y'all want to talk about exercise, intermittent fasting? Okay. Cannabis pet. I'm pretty sure they're ferns. Okay, cool. Yeah, so I know we were long term. Yeah, so maybe we'll put something together about fasting, not just intermittent fasting. So maybe we'll put something. I'll start putting something together. Fasting is a super cool topic. So everyone's like into intermittent fasting nowadays, but remember that like yogis have been advocating for fasting for like thousands of years. And they're even just in pretty good HG form. So maybe what we'll do is we'll start with science, and then we'll also explore some of these spiritual traditions and share what the spiritual traditions say about this stuff. Now, remember, when we explore spiritual traditions, we're not necessarily saying that that's correct, right? So the science is going to be limited. But at the same time, like it's important to remember that spiritual traditions have been saying some stuff for a long time. And some of what they've said has turned out to be like somewhat supported by science. Best example of that is meditation, right? They've been like, Buddhists have been recommending meditation for thousands of years. And now science is starting to catch up. And they were like, yeah, mindfulness is a good thing. Whereas like that's been around for a couple thousand years. So, so we can talk about diets and stuff. So this is also where like, I wonder if we actually need to tap a different expert, because I'm not an expert in things like keto and intermittent fasting. Like I know a fair amount specifically about intermittent fasting and specifically the spiritual traditions around fasting. One of my colleagues at McLean is actually a real expert. So did some really interesting studies on ketogenic diet and epilepsy. which there's very good evidence that the ketogenic diet can be effective for epilepsy. Okay, so thanks for the suggestions. All right, shall we do, what do y'all want to do? Y'all want to do like more questions, or y'all want to take a look at posts? What do y'all think? Perfectionism and lowering expectations and dealing with unrequited feelings, or more questions? Okay, I'm seeing most people say posts. Cool's Herald is asking a great question. Help, I keep going in Sushumna and feel amazing, but it's random and so short. How do I do it on purpose? Boy, you and every other spiritual aspirant has the same question. Maybe for our meditation, we'll talk about Sushumna. I'll answer that question, okay? But at the end. Okay. So now we've got a choice, chat. Post number 1, do unrequited feelings ever go away? Post number 2, I don't know how to lower my expectations. Which one? Unrequited feelings or perfectionism? Oh no, we're still on the old, I'm polling too quickly. Oh my God. GG. I'm sorry, mods. Okay, seems like people want to do perfectionism, so we'll do that. Thank you, chat, for guiding us. Okay, so let's take a look at a post. I don't know how to lower my expectations because I don't know where the baseline is. I had a pretty abusive childhood. Okay, it was very abusive. My parents were never around. They were always working because they were business owners. Anxiety-ridden mother, abusive alcoholic smoking father, both emotionally not there. Wow, that sounds rough. I grew up with babysitters until I was 12, and I was old enough to babysit my brother. So I had the typical Asian upbringing of musical instruments, me violin, bro piano, physical abuse for, I don't even remember anymore. And every summer and after school was dedicated to SAT prep academies. I think my bro was beat more because he was a boy. My bro has his own set of issues as well. When I was 13, I had my first panic attack in one of those strict academies that watches you as you study. I didn't know it was anxiety until I was 16 and went to a counseling center for children. First time I ever heard the word anxiety too. Anyways, growing up, I knew there was something wrong with me because I wanted to die at 18. I don't even remember why, probably the depression, but looking back, I forgot how much I didn't want to be an adult. And I can't believe I'm still feeling that way a decade later. At 18, I had a mental breakdown because of college. Let's just say I was still a freshman after 3 years, and my therapist told me to drop out before it affects my GPA even longer. I've been there. From 20 to today, I've had both binge eating disorder, anorexia, body dysmorphia due to constant comparison to other girls because of my mom projecting her insecurities onto me. I've been a serial dater and became incredibly codependent to distract me from my life. After an emotionally abusive one ended, I went back to therapy and started meds. I'm in a much better place after 6 years. Strong work. I graduated from college last year, and I'm struggling to get a job because I've never had a job. And this is where the problem lies. I've been working on my portfolio to get a design job for the past, I don't know how long. My exes would joke that I'm still working on it. This is because I can't get past my own perfectionistic thinking of this could be better. And I start browsing other works and keep redoing my project over and over and over. This bothers me because I just want financial freedom away from my parents. They fight and it affects me. How do I know when I did enough? Every time I just want to finish this, I keep redoing it because I'm stuck on improvement. I just don't know when enough is really enough. wow, I really feel for this person. So this is super challenging situation to be in, right? Like, so let's just kind of recap. So the first is sometimes we grow up in a situation that we don't realize is like harmful to our mental health. And we just think it's normal, right? Because this is what we grow up with. And it may have been what your parents grew up with. So I'm not saying that we should necessarily blame the parents, but like this is where, you know, so it sounds like they were doing some really unfortunate stuff. And so I'm really happy that, first of all, this person went to a counseling center, because it's really important, if you've lived a life of hardship or you're struggling in some way, to be able to put into words and understand what is holding you back. And oftentimes that involves an actual like clinical diagnosis with clinical treatment. So this person also did, it sounds like, did really well, sort of engaging with a therapist, starting medication, actually dealing with their diagnoses of binge eating disorder, body dysmorphia, et cetera. So that's really strong work. So this is also where I'd like re-echo that if y'all are struggling with these issues, like please go see a mental health professional, right? Because that's what they're there for. And at the same time, sometimes we're left with things that are not necessarily clinical in nature. Definitely therapists can still help you with this kind of stuff like perfectionism. But at some point, you know, if we're thinking about the continuum of illness to wellness, at some point, like we can move past clinical treatment into growth. And so what we're going to focus on today, because I think the body dysmorphia, et cetera, like that's actually like very clinical in nature. So that's something that should be discussed with a therapist. But this general question of how do I know when good enough is enough? Because it's really hard, right? Like, because there's no objective standard. So let's try to understand a little bit about perfectionism, where it comes from, and how to deal with it. So the first thing is that there are a couple of issues to think about here. The first one is, I'm wondering if I should just, okay, let's diagram this out. I was going to try to do it without diagramming, but I don't think that that is good in retrospect. So let's switch over. So what are the issues here? So oftentimes when we grow up, with high expectations, what we sort of learn, so what I'm hearing from this person is that they didn't get a whole lot of encouragement, right? They didn't get a whole lot of good jobs and like pride from their parents. Maybe their parents are proud. I mean, we don't really know, but it sounds like their parents kind of treated them really harshly. And when you kind of grow up with these high expectations, what you sort of end up with is this idea of I'm not good enough. Right? And so when we sort of end up with this idea of I'm not good enough, which by the way, this relates to Ahamkar. So if you guys have watched Dr. K's guide or seen our recent videos on identity, like streams from last week, highly recommend you check it out. You sort of end up with this idea of like, I'm not good enough. And so if we think about it, if I'm not good enough, what is my antidote to that, right? It's to like build something that's perfect. Perfection is my antidote, because fundamentally, if I'm not good enough, but if I make something perfect, then no one can refute it, right? Like then like my personal, how do I remove my lack of value or the fact that I'm not good enough, or that like and we sort of see this in the post as well. Like if you look at some of these things about, eating disorder, body dysmorphia due to constant comparison. So what is constant comparison? It's also a function of the ahamkar. Right? And the key thing here is that when we make lots of comparisons, so this isn't clinical in nature, but if we just think about, like, let's say you compare yourself to a lot of very pretty people, what do those comparisons lead you to conclude in your mind? I'm not good enough. So how do we fix that? Right? We seek perfection. Now here's the problem. So I'm looking for perfection. Because if I'm not good enough, but I can produce a portfolio that is perfect, What this sort of does is gives me like resistance to not being good enough, right? It doesn't matter. We're going to remove this from the equation if my portfolio is perfect. And this is where the paralysis sets in, because what is the perfect portfolio? There's no such thing as the perfect portfolio, right? Maybe there is. I don't think so. And so now what you've done is your mind has set up a solution to a problem. Let's just call this low value. The solution is perfection. And this perfection, in turn, is unattainable, objectively. So now you're screwed, right? Because how do you really know when good enough is when enough is enough? It's a great, beautiful question. I keep stuck it because I'm stuck on improvement. How do you know? You don't. It's hard. Maybe, I mean, there's a caveat to that, right? Which is like sometimes you do have artists who will like edit and edit and edit, or like work on a song until they reach some level of like personal satisfaction with it. And they'll say, okay, this is perfect. I'm done. I'm good with it. It's good enough. So you can arrive at that sort of conclusion, but the problem is like that conclusion is going to be like, is independent of your low value, right? So like if I'm sort of rating a song, rating it or writing it, and I sort of call it perfection, what I have to do is focus on the song. I can't have my identity wrapped up in it, because then I'm not going to make an evaluation of the song like on its own 2 feet, right? This is where the ahamkar comes in. So once the ahamkar comes in and we insert low value into the equation, then we can never get here. Because now what we're doing is we're using perfection not based on its own weight, but as an antidote to our own internal value. And then it becomes unattainable. So what do you do about this? Right? Like, how do you proceed forward? So then this is, I know it's kind of weird, but like, why does it have to be perfect? This is a question you should ask yourself. Why is perfection necessary? Right? So you're making a portfolio. Like, what's wrong with it being decent? So I think oddly enough, you know, part of the reason that I find that people get stuck with questions is because like the question they're asking, it's not like because they're deficient in some way, quite the opposite. What I hear from this post is that this person is very introspective, has done a lot of good work, has worked on themselves immensely, is starting to get their life together, but they're stuck on this question. And that's because it's sort of an unanswerable question, which is why they're stuck on it, right? So because all the answerable questions they've been able to like figure out and progress in. So it sort of makes sense, right? So at some point, if you start asking the wrong question, that's where you're going to get stuck. And so I think the right question here is not to find out when enough is enough. The right move here is to learn to act despite it not being good enough. Move forward anyway. Now, this is easier said than done. It's not easy to do, but this is where just like think about it for a second, right? Because how are you going to know if it's perfect? Like, I don't know that you will. And so if that is your prerequisite to submitting a portfolio, you are setting up a prerequisite that is unattainable. And so then you will be paralyzed. And instead, what you should do is like learn to act in spite of it. And this is where, once again, that's easier said than done. And that's where, like, how do you do that? You start by asking this question, which is like, why does it have to be perfect in the first place? There are a couple of other questions you can ask yourself. One is, what does it say about me if I submit a non-perfect portfolio? This is a great question to understand your ahamkar. What does it say about you if you submit a non-perfect portfolio, right? And this is where, like, depending on what their ahamkar, what their identity says, it's going to say, you know, all kinds of nasty things, like, I'm not good enough, I'm lazy, I'm rushing things. It's going to be all kinds of negative statements. Whereas like most people, who apply for jobs or submit portfolios, like they're not perfect, right? They're just like, they're a showcase of your skill. So this is also where like, remember that when it comes to applying for things or doing things, it's not, your job isn't to be perfect. You may want to be, but your job is to show people what you can offer and let them make the choice, right? See if it lives up to what they're looking for. Because it's kind of weird, but like oftentimes, even in terms of like dating and stuff, we strive to be perfect, right? But it's like, I don't know how you can be a perfect partner, because I just don't think that that exists. But what you should really do in order to like engage in healthy relationships that are romantic in nature is like not strive for perfection, but just showcase what you are and let them decide. And this is where like this can be really, really hard, because if you grew up with parents who were kind of like rejecting towards you, you may be very sensitive to rejection. And the thought of sending your portfolio to someone and them not being amazed by it, because that's what you really want, right? That's what you crave. Is like, you're going to send out this portfolio and you're going to get a call from the CEO of the company and be like, you are the most brilliant person I've ever seen. Come and work here, please. We need you. That's what you're looking for. That's what perfection means to you, right? Is like just absolute overwhelming endorsement that overcomes the hump of low value. We're going to do so awesome that this isn't going to get in the way at all. It's just going to be straight upward. Because if that happened, like that's what you're chasing for with perfection. The thing is like you're chasing something that is not going to happen. I mean, maybe it will, but you don't need to move that far, right? You don't need to be perfect. You don't need them to have a ringing endorsement. You're just offering some help. So recognize that if you are a designer or you're striving for perfection, recognize that there are people out there who need your help. There are people out there who need things designed, right? There are people out there who need stuff. And so this is where I'd move away from trying to be perfect into the last thing that I'll sort of say is a service orientation. And recognize that somewhere out there, there's someone who's got a dream of opening up a cupcake shop. And they're the most brilliant bakers in the world, but they have no idea how to design a logo. And so for this person to achieve their dream, they need your help. And it's not about being perfect. Do you want to do a good job for them? Absolutely. Like, I'm not saying, don't get compensated and stuff like that, but like, just think a little bit about the other person. Think about the value you bring. So service orientation is really about value. Think about the value you could bring to someone with your design skills. And you may say, this is where your ego will say, well, other people could bring more value. Sure, but like, they may not be there, right? You can't let that stop you. And so dealing with perfection is kind of like, it's a tricky situation, just to kind of summarize. Because the reason we strive for perfection is because of a low sense of value that we have. And then our solution is perfection. Because if I'm crap and I can do a perfect job, then like, easy. I don't have, this ignores this. It overcomes my low value. The problem is that the standard we set up for ourselves is unattainable and paralyzing. And if it's unattainable and paralyzing, then we stay stuck. We don't actually move forward. So how do you combat that? You start off by sort of asking yourself, why do you have to be perfect in the first place? Why can't you just be good enough? And this is where like, but when is good enough really good enough? Well, like, why does it have to be good enough? Why can't you just try with what you've done so far? Right? What's wrong with it being decent? And then eventually, what you really want to do is not figure out what is good enough and what is perfection. It's the wrong question. It's to move in spite of not knowing. Because the perfection gives you certainty. Because if it's perfect, then you know. Like, if you submit something perfect, like, of course, they're going to say wonderful things. So what you're really trying to solve is the issue of uncertainty. And uncertainty is especially scary when you have low value internally. I'm not saying that you have low value as a person. I'm saying like your concept of yourself may be low value. And so what you need to do is abandon the question entirely. Don't try to answer it because it's the wrong question. You're never going to be able to answer it. And then the last thing to think a little bit about is get outside of your own head and recognize that like if you've been working this hard on a design portfolio, like you can help someone else with it, right? You can earn money from it. You can deliver value to another human being and gain some financial independence. And that's what you should move towards. Go to the world and say, hey, this is what I have to offer. Who's interested? Who could benefit from what I have to offer? And the more that you do that kind of thing, like that's where I think your life will start improving. It's the ethos of why we started this whole thing in the first place. Is like, I sort of asked the question, maybe I have something to offer. Who's interested? And here we are. And the key thing is that I'm not better or worse than anyone else out there. Each and every one of you has something very unique to offer. And it's not about being perfect. It's not about being good enough. Just offer whatever you have to give and let them decide whether it's enough or not. Because as long as you're looking for a perfect answer in your head, you will never offer it in the first place. And thereby, you are actually depriving people of the opportunity of benefiting from the value that you bring to the world. Questions? Seriously. How do they know what they want? That's why you give them a portfolio, right? Because they don't know, like, I'm designing cupcakes, so I'm going to send you a portfolio. And you're like, hey, do you like any of this stuff? And they're like, yeah, page 3 looks pretty cool. Can you do page 3, but in a cupcake form? Right? What if no one wants it? Then you go back to the drawing board. But even then, like, so what if no one wants it is one of these black and white thinking kind of questions. So let's dig into the question for a second. What if no one wants it? How many people are you going to ask before you conclude that no one wants it? This is what happens, right? So when you have low self-value, you ask 3 people and you conclude no one wants it. There are like 8 billion people in the world. You can't say no one wants it until you go and ask each and every one of them. Now, you can clearly say these 3 people don't want it, but that's also how you change your mindset, right? Because like this is where we love to jump to conclusions. The Humkar loves to jump to conclusions. Oh, no one wants what I have to offer. And so like, how do you know at that point, should I ask more people or should I work on my portfolio? And that's where, like, by all means, like, go back to the drawing board and, like, make your portfolio 10% better. Add something else. Or even ask people, like, hey, what do y'all feel is missing from this portfolio? What are you really looking for? And then, like, get that feedback. And then improve your portfolio. And then go ask 3 more people. Or maybe 3 people isn't enough. And what you need to do is just ask 10. Is it really bad to chase that perfection if that is your goal? I'm going to go ahead and say I don't think it's the best strategy. So I've worked with a lot of people for whom chasing perfection has been very effective up to a point. But I don't think, I think chasing perfection is the way that you get to end game, but it is not post end game. So like, for example, I don't know that Stephen King ever tried to actually, I've never talked to the dude, but if you read his book On Writing, I don't know that he set out to create something perfect. That wasn't his goal. Like most of the artists that I've talked to don't set out for perfection. They set out to like create something because of the thing. Right? Stephen King like wanted to tell a story and he wanted to create a story and wanted to see where these characters go. So there's a certain authenticity, whereas I personally advocate for focusing on the next step forward as opposed to the last step. Now you should have some idea in mind of eventually where you want to go. Like absolutely. We're not saying like ignore the top of the peak. But I don't know that summiting the peak is the most important thing. I think taking the next step is the most important thing. And as you take the next step and as you take the next step and as you take the next step, the step that you're about to take is almost identical to the step that you will take to reach the summit, right? It's just one step up. It's actually the same. The problem is that focusing on perfection can get complicated. And I'm not saying that you shouldn't do it at all. Like I said, I've worked with a lot of people who have in a very generally speaking, successful way, focused on being the best. But I don't personally find that is usually then after I work with them for a while, they step away from that. And people are super confused because they're like, how do I get better if I'm not focused on perfection or the goal? And you can, it's different. So one person's asking, why do I hate myself every time I do something worse than others? Because every time you do something worse than others, you have confirmation of the belief that you are afraid is true, which is that you are not as good as other people. In a snap decision, I have no idea who you are. I have no idea what's going on in your life. But the thing that we hate, the thing that we beat ourselves up for, are when that which we fear about ourselves, that which we hope to the deepest core of our being is not true. And we get some piece of evidence that suggests that which we are trying to deny to ourselves, like, oh my God, I hope it's not true. I hope it's not true. I hope it's not true. And when you get some evidence for it, you hate yourself because, God damn it. I knew it was true. Damn it. And then you beat yourself up for it. I don't know. But that's like completely armchair quarterbacking. So take that not with a grain of salt, with an ocean's worth of salt. Because I've never met you before. I have no idea what's going on in your life. But if you ask the question, why do I hate myself every time I do something worse than others? That would be my first gut instinct. Okay? Who decided the human mentality? Evolution, my friends. Evolution. So this is where we have to remember, right, that the brain did not evolve for peace. It evolved for survival. And that's why this stuff is so hard. Right? Because like the brain is not designed to be chill. It's designed to help you survive. I mean, I believe that personally. And so that's why like it takes work to almost go against our natural instincts. And that's in a sense what spirituality is a field. And then you could even say on a deep level that at the opposite end of spirituality is not going against your instincts, but really returning to them in its deepest and truest form. What is my understanding? Okay, let me just think about, okay, so do y'all want to meditate, do a couple questions, and who are we going to raid? Because we got to wrap up soon, chat. Okay, I promised y'all an answer about Sushumna, so we're going to talk about this. This meditation is going to be super simple because it's going to be about discovery of Sushumna. So I'm going to teach y'all how to find the Sushumna. So in the yogic tradition, there are two energy channels that essentially like are governed by our nostrils. So we have this one thing called the Ida, which is the moon channel, or like the parasympathetic nervous system is sort of what it's been correlated with. So it's like cool, calm, etc. And then on the flip side, on the right side, we have the Pingala, which is the Surya channel or the sun channel. So this is like heat, activity, whatever. So like basically like what yogis were sort of doing, this is how I've come to understand it, is they were employing something called a heuristic, which is like a tool for understanding. So it's not that the sun is actually in your right nostril and the moon is actually in your right nostril. It's that if we look at the world, we can tend to divide the world into black and white, right? So like there's good, there's bad, there's hot, there's cold, there's tall, there's short, that fundamentally the world can be split apart into polarity. And so they sort of developed these two kind of concepts of sun and moon to represent, like metaphorically, the duality of the world. And so between, and then this is where things get kind of weird. But so then what they also did is like correlate these with like energy channels. So this kind of goes back to like the Sanskrit theory of prana or the Chinese theory of qi, which is essentially the same, which is this theory that we have a vital life energy that kind of flows through us. Now, let's remember that people have been looking for scientific evidence for prana and qi for like the better part of 100 years, I want to say, and no one has found anything conclusive, okay? That being said, there are some interesting caveats there too, because practices that are developed based on the theory of prana or qi seem to outperform practices that are developed based on pure physiology. So a simple example of this is that yoga has been found in some clinical trials to be superior to exercise. And so it's like kind of weird, like what explains that difference? Is it that qi is real? That's where some people will jump to that conclusion. I don't quite jump to that conclusion. What I think is that, once again, this was a system that was developed where they figured out certain things, and then they kind of like, those things had real physiologic or neuroscientific correlates. And so they sort of, how can I say this? You can't see the wind, but you can see the sails. So what they sort of did is they said, okay, there's this like mythical substance called the wind, even though it's not directly observable, but has some effects which turn out to be correct. That's kind of the best analogy I have. So there's no real scientific evidence for qi or prana. But oddly enough, the practices that are based on it seem to have some utility above purely biological things, right? So that too is up for debate. So what is Sushumna? So between Ida and Pingala, there is something called Sushumna. So there are two major channels that go up and down along our spine. Ida is on the left and Pingala is on the right. And Sushumna runs between them. And what people say in the yogic tradition is that when you meditate with Sushumna open, that is when your meditation is incredibly productive. So this is something that you may have experienced where like the quality of your meditation fluctuates, right? And we'll say like, oh, I was distracted or I just wasn't good today. And we'll attribute all kinds of different things like I'm distracted or I didn't sleep well or stuff like that, which could have some influence on it. But when Sushumna opens, the meditation is very productive. So a couple of things about how to find Sushumna. One is Sushumna is likely to open at the moment of dawn and at the moment of dusk. This is why in meditative traditions, people will recommend that you meditate during these times. So here's the practice that I'm going to teach y'all today. It's going to be just observing the breath and trying to find Sushumna. And the way that you do this, for all of y'all that have done alternate nostril breathing, remember that we do this. You can try this now. Right? So just take a moment to breathe through each nostril, in and out. And what you'll notice is that one of your nostrils is more clogged than the other, usually. So when Sushumna opens, both of your nostrils are equally open. So the first place to find Sushumna is just with your nostrils. So all you have to do, so this is the practice, right? So we'll kind of like, I'll demonstrate, but you can't really do it. I mean, you should do it at dawn and dusk. So we're going to sit up straight. And if you do alternate nostril breathing enough, what you'll be able to do is detect, even without blocking, which of your nostrils is open. So once you do alternate nostril breathing for a couple of weeks, you'll be able to detect. So now just breathe in and out through your nose. And what you should be able to feel, if you've practiced enough, is that one of your nostrils is more open than the other. So let's just take a moment to notice that. So notice which nostril is open. So just take a moment to notice. You can keep your eyes closed as you breathe. Which one of your nostrils is open? And then I want you to just watch. And the more you do this practice, I want you to catch Sushumna opening. You'll feel this like opening kind of at the top or back of your nose, where suddenly both nostrils will be open. And they'll transition from whichever one is open now, both will be open, and then they'll switch. And when you are in that state, that is the opening of Sushumna. So if you do a meditative practice during that time, so for example, if you do mantra practice, you can chant a mantra. If you want to do a sankalpa practice, you can use a sankalpa, which is like a resolve that you kind of plant within yourself. So I find that mantra practice is very, very productive when Sushumna is open. Or whatever kind of practice that you're doing. You can do a metta meditation, like a self-compassion meditation, a gratitude meditation. You can do a focusing meditation, sort of a hardcore meditation. You can ask yourself some of these questions like, who am I? Where does perfection come from? You don't want to engage too much in intellectual activity, but just look within yourself in those moments and just observe. And if you catch that transition, just try to sit within the transition for as long as you can. And that is how you find Sushumna. So doing your third eye practice during Sushumna opening is another really good example. Right? What is hardcore meditation? It's like serious sadhana. So Kundalini sadhana is like a good example of like hardcore meditation. These serious, deeper, esoteric techniques that are like that monks will practice, right, up in caves in the Himalayas. Got it? Yeah, so any tips for being more self-aware of cognitive distortions? So yeah, let's remember this. A cognitive distortion is within the mind. Awareness is outside the mind. So cultivate your awareness and you'll gain power over cognitive distortions over time. So there's a good video about that in Dr. K's Guide to Meditation, I believe, on states of consciousness, where we assume that awareness and mental activity are one and the same, but they're not. Right? So you'll understand this, for example, with daydreaming. So in daydreaming, you lose awareness, but mental activity is super high. And you'll also notice in some moments of meditation where you have a no mind state, but you're not asleep. You're like fully aware and it feels kind of really good and you lose track of time. And so that's the state of meditation. Do you also identify as 0 on a good day? All right, chat, who are we rating? Raid No Arm Watley. Okay. Let's check. Let's just make sure that this person is streaming. Okay. We're gonna raid. This guy's playing LOL, so let's raid No Arm Watley. Okay. All right, GG chat. We'll see y'all. Hopefully we'll stream tomorrow. Stay tuned to our socials. We kind of took Monday off and we wanted to stream today, so we'll let y'all know. If not, probably Friday. So hope y'all are doing well, and we'll see y'all later. Take care.